Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Tristans Tao, Vice President of Solutions at Iterable. Tristan is also a member on our PreSales Leadership Collective Council. The topic of today's episode is Unconventional Path to PreSales. And the reason why today's episode is so interesting is that Tristan is going to talk about his journey of immigrating to the United States, how he worked as a software engineer, how he worked as a co-founder, and a contract CTO before making his move into pre-sales. And it's a really fun journey, and I really enjoy Tristan's perspective as I've gotten to know Tristan well through PreSales Leadership Collective over the last couple of months. And so you're in for a real treat, and enjoy today's episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Avneo. Feeling a little overwhelmed in your bid management, thinking there must be a better and more efficient way to manage RFPs, RFIs, and security questionnaires? Look no further than Avneo RFX, a Salesforce native, fully automated RFX solution designed to help you win more of the right business. To learn more, head over to avneo.com or search Avneo in the Salesforce App Exchange. Tristans Tao, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, James. Great to be here.
I'm glad to have you, Tristan. You know, it's been a pleasure getting to know you over the past 6 or so months because you are on our PreSales Leadership Collective Council. You know, I got to ask, for you, what was it that made you want to join the Leadership Collective Council and get more involved in PreSales Collective generally?
I think, I saw you guys start early on and just catch traction so quickly. And from that perspective, I knew that there was something special here from a community side. And the reality is, I also think that pre-sales is the future of how we're going to sell. And I think it's this not necessarily emerging, but this industry that's just starting to blow up and everyone's trying to get into it. And yet there wasn't really a standard structure, a standard process, a standard organization. And I wanted to be a part of something that could start it and also shape how this eventually turns out. So that opportunity was just obvious when I heard about the Leadership Council, and I just had to be a part of it.
I absolutely agree. And I feel like the work that we're doing with PreSales Collective and the Leadership Collective and a lot of the ecosystem that's popping up now will pay dividends 5 to 10 years down the line. And we'll look back and say, hey, remember when PreSales Collective started? And being a part of that journey, that's what it's all about. And, I know something that matters to you is paying it forward and helping people out. And you're actually helping lead a mentorship program within the Leadership Collective. So tell me a little bit more about that program.
We realized the biggest value that we have as a collective group is just immense level of talent we have within our community. And everyone knows that you don't get to where you are alone. And I think some people along the way stumble across really great mentors. And we ask the question of what if we're able to foster this environment where you're meeting someone and that someone is really trying to help you level up whatever you're looking for, whether that's personally or professionally. And so we thought about starting this mentorship program. And so far, we have a wide range of individuals from managers on the front line all the way to SVPs who run global sales engineer organizations who are helping us build this program that mentors individuals. We're pairing people up, we're getting people what they need, and we're launching this 6 months program to help people get leveled up.
I love what you said about not doing this alone. That's extremely important. And the truth. Tristan, let's talk about you today. So typically I start with tell us your story, but your story is actually going to be the main premise of today's episode. So the topic of today's episode is Unconventional Path to Pre-Sales. Tell us your story. Let's start in the beginning, Tristan.
My story is quite unconventional because I was born in China, spent 6 years there, moved to Japan, spent 6 years there. I moved to the US when I was 12. This was back in 2004. I spent a couple of years in LA, a couple of years in Davis, a couple of years around the Bay. I mean, just a lot of moving around in general. And finally, I settled down in the Bay for a little bit. Now I'm in Santa Monica. One of the theme is just jumping around. And I think that also follows when you look at my professional background around some of the things I've done in the past. And I think truly ending up at PreSales was a great fortune that I've been able to have. And I'm really grateful for that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Tristan, if you're okay to talk about it a little bit, you really overcame a lot coming to the US, especially. Is that right?
Coming to the US, I think, wasn't easy. That's what I'll say. I remember coming, I said April 12th, 2004. And when we got here, it was a big, scary world. I was 12 years old, as I mentioned. And the first experience I had was actually at the airport. This is a funny story now that I look back at it. But My mom was working at California State University of Northridge, which is acronymized as CSUN. And we told them, the immigration officer, that, yeah, we work at California State University of Northridge. And he kept repeating back, okay, so what department in CSUN? And we didn't know what he meant by CSUN. So we kept asking, what is CSUN? And then he turned around and flagged us as suspicious immediately because we don't know what it is that he was talking about. He was throwing this word around. And so we got detained for a couple of hours because there was just a lot of misunderstanding. So that was a rough start in general. That was my first impression of the US. And I remember thinking, man, this is quite different than where I was coming from.
Man, that's a powerful story, Tristan. I mean, that's made an impact on you that you could still reflect to the date that you made it over here. But you've really done a lot in your career since coming over to the US in 2004. And it's been quite impressive, Tristan. And I've really enjoyed getting to know you. And I want to talk about your journey because it is, again, unconventional and a different path. Talk about professionally, you've done a number of different roles and you were working in software engineering and data science. And so I'm curious on how those types of roles prepared you for this lifestyle in pre-sales.
Well, to add to that, I actually originally started out wanting to be a quant trader. So that's where the data science and engineering and the finance component came in. But I think working in all of the collective things you talked about in terms of software engineering, in terms of data science, you learn customer empathy. The people that we sell into ultimately are software engineer, data scientists. And when you're able to understand what they're going through, there's so much that a lot of the times the seller has been selling his entire life. And there's a complete, not lack of understanding, but the inability to connect because they haven't done the actual job versus having done the job, having seen what you actually go through as an end user. That's really, really helpful and useful in a deal cycle. Ultimately, I think being that data scientist, being that engineer, and being that product manager and all of the above allows you to connect with different people within the organization because, again, you speak their language and you know exactly how they think and what they're going through.
That's a great perspective, Tristan, because we've had this discussion on the podcast before where people who come from post-sales, they understand how a product actually works. And so when they're in the sales process, and speaking to customers and prospects, they can talk about the actualities of the product. When you have that level of depth and that understanding of what actually happens behind the scenes, can make you more dangerous in the pre-sales. I think Pavel Martin at Sprinkler talked about it as being in pre-sales, you're building the Hollywood set, but in post-sales, you're actually building the house. You're building the entire thing. It is a real difference in approach. But personally, as someone who came from post-sales, I thought that post-sales made me a very, very good pre-sales professional because I really understood the how.
That's exactly right. I couldn't have put it better. I'm probably going to steal that in the future. The Hollywood set in the real house. I'm a fan.
Pre-sales professionals are great at reusing content and not reinventing the wheel. So shout out to Pavel Martin, who really taught me that one. It's resonated with me, obviously. I appreciate you talking about your interesting background with data science and software and product. But fast forward a bit, you started your own company. Tell us about what that company was, why'd you start it, and where that company is now.
So the company we built was called LIDA, and this was back in 2014. LIDA stands for Learn Data. And what we learned or what we observed was that people were struggling to work with data, even though the world was just being filled with data. And so we wanted to create this online education company that allowed non-technical people the basic foundation of how to analyze data. We were teaching them R, SQL, Python, and we were up-leveling their skill set from a data analysis perspective. And we were specifically targeting non-data scientists because data scientists already know this. But if you work in history, if you work in biology, if you work in marketing, understanding how to build SQL charts or use Looker, for example, goes a really, really long way. That was something we spent some time building. The company went through ups and downs, as you know how our startup goes. In the very end, we ended up pivoting it into a university model. So ultimately, the materials were used at some of the top universities around the US. And we were really proud of the final accomplishment. And at the very tail end of it, I think we unfortunately lost passion for what we were building because it turned into this content for university type of company. And so we ended up winding it down after it hit profitability. And I'll give a plug for my then co-founder who spun the company into a different company called With Ralph, which is a negotiation company. It helps minorities who are oftentimes too scared to negotiate during an offer stage with Facebook. And he has tremendous impact helping them increase their offers by tens of thousands of dollars.
Wow, that's incredible. I appreciate that perspective and love that you guys have turned that into something new and valuable for the community. We talked about this before. You were working as a YC-backed company. Is that right?
That is correct.
What was that like?
YC is a very special period of mine. And I think you can read about this, but the most memorable is once a week, you're sitting in a room with your batch, right? We had 16 people in our sub cohort. And our advisors are just, some of the most famous founders. And one of them for us, for example, was Justin Kahn, founder of Twitch. And we go around in a circle talking about our progress. And the theme is, why aren't you Google yet? And that was the mentality every week. There are 16 other unbelievably talented founders who are all talking about their accomplishments, their challenges, the new highs that they're reaching. And it was this high pressure cooker that really forced you to be the best. And so from there, we were able to accelerate our growth, but also honestly lose a couple of years of expected life expectancy. It was all in all worth it. It was an amazing learning experience.
That sounds amazing. Do you think that experience has given you the work ethic that you continue on to have today?
I absolutely think so. I think work ethic is one, but I think work ethic comes and goes depending on where I am. But rather, more importantly, it taught me what great looks like. And I saw what great people did. And you hear about, you're the average of 5 people around you. By then, you could randomly pick 5 people within that batch. And I knew I wanted to be like them. And that really reset my mind for what I could accomplish if I put my mind to it.
That's amazing, Tristan. That sounds like a great experience for sure. I'm glad it's resonated with you as well. And I think just kind of tying your dots, I see probably the similarities of why you want to get involved in the mentorship program and give back to the community, because I think there's probably some similarities from that experience that you had.
That's exactly right. And I think, you're always in your own head and you can try to self-coach as much as possible, but the unknown unknowns are always there. And for me, when I meet someone new, and that's you included, James, there's always this clicking of, wow, there's something I've never thought about, a perspective I haven't really gone down. And I think that was really important for me during YC. And that's something we're trying to create and foster with the mentorship program as well.
I appreciate the same. And I think that's been one of my learnings with PreSales Collective is when you just talk to people and you meet different people and understand how they're doing different things, it does allow for that click moment. It does allow you to think a little bit differently. And I think that's really what the premise of this entire community is really all about from my perspective. But Tristan, one of the things I was really interested in talking about today is that you feel that there are similarities between starting your own company and pre-sales.
That's exactly right. And I think there are 2 ways in which I think they're similar. One is mindset. When you are an entrepreneur, when you're a founder, you are the owner. You own the entire thing and you think very, very critically about what's going to help your business, what's not going to help the business, what is actually going to work, what the drawbacks are. And it forces you to think like an executive. And this is absolutely critical because you hear all the time you are relegated to who you sound like. And if you are able to sound like a founder or an owner or an executive, it goes a really long way. Even when I started in pre-sales, I was very comfortable speaking with other executives because I've been one of an extremely unsuccessful company, granted, but that still gave me the perspective of being an owner. And I think that was really helpful when I started. I think the second component is a skill set. Starting a company, you are really doing everything, right? Sales, tech, product, IT, mopping the floor, whomever you need to ultimately sell to, you've probably done that role. And no other job other than starting a company or entrepreneurship gives you that much exposure into different aspects of a company, which again, allows you to build customer empathy.
Incredible perspective. I love that. I think you're right. You have to do everything as a founder. And sometimes in this pre-sales role, the role's not always defined. We have so many different roles and responsibilities, and the way that we're actually compensated and evaluated isn't always very straightforward. So I like that you talk about that. You mentioned a word that really struck with me is the empathy component. What did being a founder of your own company teach you about empathy?
I think being about the founder of a company really forces you to understand what being in each position within a company is. And I think at the end of the day, when you're living through it, when you're the one writing the code and when things are not working, when you're the one making the cold call, when you're the one generating the pipeline, when you're the one who's writing the legal contract, I think you really start to think there are these other people and their roles are just difficult and everything is so hard versus I think other times in sales, I come in and say, your job is easy. Use our tools and it'll be easier. And it's just not true. Being a founder really drilled that into my head.
That's awesome. And I think the one thing that you said that really resonated with me is that you had to think critically and you had to really speak a certain language. And I think that some of the best pre-sales professionals that approach their business and their prospects like it's their own business really can be the most successful ones.
James, I think you put it really well. The perspective I think about is when you're starting out, sometimes you are the outsider coming in and you're trying to think about where does my software fit in their world? And I don't think that's the right mentality. And instead, it's more of what does their world look like and what problems are they solving for? And when you understand that, and when you understand that better than your customer, I think that's when it really clicks. And then naturally, hopefully, your software just falls in there as one of the pieces.
Bam. That's that wow moment, Tristan. I mean, that really is that wow moment. And that's how you provide value as a pre-sales professional. You understand their business and you understand your product and you come in and provide immense value. That's how they end up having trust. I think that's what makes, again, good pre-sales professionals. So I really, really enjoy your perspective here. And I'm going to ask you a more serious question. Is there a situation or an experience that really stretched you when you were leading your own company?
The entire time you're being stretched, but I'll say one stretch that I think almost broke us was the departure of one of our co-founders. It was a 3-person company at the very beginning and things were tough. And for a variety of reasons, we had someone depart. It was amicable. And the tough part was he was a friend. There was an emotional component and he was someone we've been in the trenches. We lived together and there was an emotional aspect that was challenging. But also when you think about the fact that a 3-person company losing someone that's 33% of your workforce, imagine your company, wherever you are, 33% of people departing, it makes things really, really tough. And so it helped me understand how to navigate through chaos. And it helped me understand how to plan for the unplannable. And ultimately, end of the day, everything works out. And that person's on to his next company, which is crushing, by the way. And we were able to move on and continue to grow too.
That concept of chaos is always an interesting one. If you take 33% of the workforce out, it can present a lot of challenges. And I appreciate all your perspective on your company and the success of that company. What made you decide to pivot to sales engineering?
It's a great question. After we've sunsetted or turned the company into autopilot for a period, I went through a self-searching period. I spent a month in Nepal, doing all those things. I really had to come back and try to get a new role. And I think I had a friend who was an AE at Okta, and he said, hey, you should try sales engineering based on my background. And I actually foolishly said, hey, that sounds stupid. How can sales and engineering be one job? They're different jobs. And I've moved on. And so after looking around and doing a couple of different jobs, I did some contract CTO, some business development. I naturally came to conclude that, man, if there was a job where you can talk to people, do some selling, serving of the customer, and remain technical, that would be awesome. And I remember facepalming a little bit and thinking, that's what sales engineering is. And so it took me a little bit longer than I think most people to realize how amazing of a job it really is. But once that clicked for me, I was full speed ahead and looking for a sales engineering role.
This is what happens in life, right? You hear something and you make a decision like, this doesn't work for me. And then you come full circle months later. And you're like, oh, well, that does make sense. It sounds like a good role for me. It's great that you made that move and you joined sales engineering and you've joined an awesome company, which has really been very, very successful. And, congratulations to you because you've gone from lead to director to senior director and now VP. And so there's plenty of people listening that want to know your secret. What has it been that has allowed you to have such success?
I appreciate you highlighting it. But when I think about success, there are a couple of different factors that, the actual tactical strategic factors that goes into a company that does well. But I do want to highlight a quote that I read a long time ago, back again when I was trying to be a trader, right? It's a book, I think, from Market Wizard. And the quote is by Ed Seykota. And it's, some people were lucky enough to be born smart, while others were even smarter and got born lucky. And it just highlights the fact that luck, end of the day, is an element. So I am really, really fortunate. So with that, out of the way, there are a couple of things that I do want to bring up as I think about evaluating a company. For me, Iterable grew so quickly. There was fundamentally a need for it. The timing was right. The market is massive. The competition, we were one of the best tools you could really buy. And so looking for that right company, I think is really important, as I was able to grow on the back of, honestly, Iterable growing massively over the last couple of years. Some of the other things that I think about when you're in a company is owning and solving everyone's problem. I owned and solved as many problems as I could. And being a sales engineer, again, gives you this unique position because you see it all. And you're oftentimes at the intersection of different departments, and you can see problems that many people do not see. And so taking advantage of that allowed me opportunities to move up as well. And again, a nod to being an entrepreneur. Every problem is your problem when you're a founder. That's just the reality. And so that was my mentality. And I knew with every problem I solved, I would be growing along the way. And then as I'm owning these other problems, I think embracing growth mindset is just so important. And the advice I received really early on through YC is find people who are better than you and talk to them. And so as I was building out the sales engineering function at Iterable, I spoke with sales engineering leaders in other organizations. I mean, shout out to Prakash, who ran sales engineering at Segment. Shout out to Trey, who ran sales engineering at Cloudflare. Almost worked there. He actually interviewed me. And afterwards, I asked him to essentially not be a mentor, but I reached out and we kept in touch. And those unofficial mentorship were really important. Lastly, always measuring how you're growing, right? If your company is growing, there's always this idea that the company may outgrow you. And that's okay. That's the reality. But I was really conscious of, okay, how am I growing in comparison to the company, and making sure that I'm growing the same way. And then last thing I guess I do have to bring up is there's this hype of being higher in the org is better. And there's this hype of wanting to get to the next level. And I've done some of that, but I look back and I say the best moments weren't the day I got the call that I was being promoted, but rather the moments I shared with the people along the way. And I think I do have to just emphasize to all the listeners to, as cliche as may be, cherish those moments, because whether you move up or lateral, wherever you go, those are the moments that really matter.
That's actual advice, Tristan. You mentioned the word chaos earlier, and that's something that has resonated with me for spending most of my career in startups and now a founder myself. Do you feel like that environment and that growth was chaotic per se? And did your experiences as a founder prepare you to navigate that type of environment?
I think chaos is interesting. And for me, when I think about Iterable, I would describe it as chaos, but I would also describe it as controlled chaos, or at least most of the chaos was intentional. It's like a controlled explosion. And that is what allows you to grow at an unprecedented rate. That is when you're doing things that have never been done before. And I think it's one of the more successful ways in building a venture-backed company. Having started a company, having lived through control and uncontrolled chaos, being at Iterable, I think it was really helpful to go back to that mentality that chaos is a part of life. Expect chaos and embrace it. And so I would attribute a lot of my success, again, to having lived through that as a founder as well.
That's great perspective. One of the things that you mentioned that I've talked about on the podcast before is this being caught up in the hype of being higher in the organization. Rob Falcone joked on his episode that he was a COO. Him and Sheryl Sandberg were both COOs at the same time with not as many roles and responsibilities. And I do think we get kind of caught up in the promotion cycles without sometimes focusing on the experience. Just a personal story is I was a director at Showpad and had a lot of responsibilities, and felt that if I wanted to take the next step in my career, I actually needed to go to a company like Salesforce that was a larger enterprise platform company and get that experience. And so it took a title downgrade, but that experience was what I needed to be more well-rounded professional. And so, that's something I like to put out there, because if you get thrust into a situation and you're just chasing a title, you might not be prepared for that role based off your experiences. And, you want to be most prepared to take a role that you could be successful at. And so that's just something that resonated with me. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
That's a great advice, James. At the end of the day, you want to be where you are stretched just enough. And so thinking less about the title and more about the experience and how you work and how you serve, I think is important.
Absolutely. And I think just to cap it off is You talked about, are you growing at the same rate that the company's growing? Like, that's an incredible insight. And I think that's a good retrospective for people to ask themselves that are listening to the podcast. As we kind of close, what kind of advice do you have for the people who want to make a transition into pre-sales?
I think my advice is realize that it's possible. I don't know if people are thinking that I'm not a pre-sales professional. Can I be a pre-sales professional? I mean, so many pre-sales people come from different backgrounds, and I think that allows them to succeed. In fact, I would say being a career pre-sales, meaning I came out of school and I became a pre-sales professional, I think that's really rare. So just know that everyone comes from a different path. It's important for you to try to leverage that path. And I think that the second advice is that reach out to people who are already in pre-sales, go to the community, go learn. And I think part of the mentorship program is all about that. It's about doing things that you haven't done before, meeting people who've done things you haven't done before. And if you're not in pre-sales, I think with the emergence of programs or groups like PreSales Collective, there are so many like-minded individuals who are all trying to help you. And so talking to these people who are not necessarily ahead, but in a different place is going to amplify your journey in going into pre-sales. And I highly encourage other people to do that. And I know that's something I've repeatedly done in terms of, okay, I'm in point A. How do I get to point B? I find people who are in point B and I talk to them. And every time it's provided me with a fresh perspective on how I can get to point B myself.
Great points. And that's some of the things we need to do with PreSales Collective is that it's the best job that no one's ever heard of. And we need to bring more awareness to this role and to this profession. And you're right. So many people feel like, hey, I don't have the experience to make the jump. I don't think I can do it yet, but they can. So great advice. And Tristan, thanks for being on the podcast today. And thank you for all the work that you do with the Leadership Collective and giving back to the community.
Absolutely, Jim. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Talk to you next time.
Cheers.
All right, PreSales Collective. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's great to hear Tristan's success story. I loved so many things that he said today and felt they were really actionable. And many of us, no matter where we are in our journey, can take those learnings and bring them into our own lives. One of the things that I really liked that Tristan talked about was working in other roles helped him understand what mattered to the end user and how it helped connect dots. I mean, that's really important as pre-sales professionals. Again, understanding what happens to the customer and putting ourselves in their environment. Tristan also highlighted understanding customer needs and being buyer-centric and talking about not only how does my software fit in their world, but understanding their world and making an easy, seamless process for you to sell your technology to that company. When we unpack the layers of Tristan's other experiences, you could tell that his experience as a co-founder and a YC-backed company has really shaped his pre-sales journey. I like that he talked about what great actually looks like. And one of the things that has really resonated with me is that he talked about being a business owner and being hypercritical of everything that you do. You have to be the executive. And so bringing that to pre-sales not only reminds me of PreSales Collective, but also reminds me of my own experiences in startups when you're wearing a lot of hats and there's a lot of chaos going on. How do you really approach that as the business owner, making sure that you are putting your best foot forward at all times? The last thing I want to highlight is Tristan's advice on how he's been successful at Iterable, the growth of the company, understanding and trying to solve problems, having that growth mindset, measuring if he is growing as the company is growing, and not getting caught up in the hype of being higher in the organization, really cherishing those moments with coworkers, I thought was an incredible point and really a humbling perspective that really resonates with me personally, and I hope it resonates with you. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I will see you next week.